Erev Tov to everyone. Good evening. I'll invite everyone to take a seat. Welcome to B'nai Jeshurun if you aren't a regular here. I'm Rabbi Felicia Saul. I'm joined by my colleague Rabbi Roli Matalon, and Rabbi Becca Weintraub is not here this evening, but we want to welcome you to, is the beginning of a series of, we in the early spring were thinking about the fall and the anticipation of the election, and also all that had happened over the last year, and thought we really wanted to kind of just move out not only of the kind of work on the ground to be engaged in our politics and our election, but also to kind of be able to step up on the mezzanine and really think about the nature of the intersection of Jewish life in national politics. And so this series was born, and when we thought about who would be a great thought partner for that, really there was no one else to call but the Hartman Institute, who we've partnered with for many, many years in lots of different ways, and always feel like we grow and are stretched in beautiful and powerful ways through their leadership and their thinking. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone here tonight, and this is the first stop, and Rabbi Justice Baird will share the coming lectures, but I want to now invite Rabbi Justice Baird, who's the Executive Vice President of the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America.
Thank you, Rabbi Sol. My role at Hartman, I direct the research center at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I guess I want to get us going tonight by saying that it was a little more than a decade ago, I heard a preacher from the Bronx who was at an interfaith event. It was a gala, and she was giving her talk, and her message was, save some for yourself. And this pastor, she was very active in a variety of social justice movements. She was juggling the daily, even hourly challenges of a congregation. She was involved in many local political issues, and her message, save some for yourself, really came from the fact that she had learned if you don't save some for yourself, no one is going to do it for you. And the message really resonated with the crowd, all of whom were passionate activists. Obviously resonated with me. It was a decade ago that I heard that message. And I think the demands on our attention have really only grown in the last decade. And the feelings that the world is burning and that maybe only we are the ones who can save it are only more intense. This week is a good example of those feelings. As diaspora Jews, our hearts are in the East as war with Hezbollah is emerging and the hostages are still in captive, and at the same time, our hearts are here at home in the United States. So as we gear up to head to the polls, which is the sort of the framing of this series, we have a chance tonight to take a breath, to get on the balcony with an inspiring teacher, Tamara Mann Tweel, who is going to teach us about the balance between leaning back or stepping back and leaning in. Tonight is the opening of a three-part series that we've called Heading to the Polls, American Jewish Civics in a Post-October 7th World. We're going to gather again for the second one in a few weeks on October 30th with Alana Stein-Hain at Anshe Chesed, and we'll close the series after the election on November 19th with Yehuda Kurtzer at Rodef Shalom. And these two congregations, along with the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, were the brain trust, as Rabbi Sol was mentioning, for this series. So to all of you here in person at B'nai Jeshurun here in New York City, to those of you who are online, who are watching tonight, and to those of you who are watching a recording of this program after the fact, I want to say welcome. Thank you for choosing to put your attention toward this topic in this difficult time, and I suspect that we are all here because we have some sense that our democracy just really needs us in this moment. And to our gracious hosts, the clergy and staff and leadership of B'nai Jeshurun, who have made it possible for all of us to be together, thank you so much. So let me now introduce our teacher. Tamara Mann Tweel is the Senior Program Director for the Civic Initiatives at the Teagle Foundation And because this is also a Hartman program, I will say she is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. You have her bio in the papers that we handed out and also online, but let me just note that Tamara has really built her career in civic education with high school students, with college students, with faith leaders. She is deeply committed to American civil society, as you will see, and to civic leadership, and I want to thank her deeply for teaching us tonight. Welcome, Tamara.
Well, it is really wonderful to be here with so many friends, colleagues, teachers, and most importantly, my parents who are here today. So I'm very, very grateful. Tonight, what I want to do is give over a set of ideas that I've really been thinking about for quite a while and are really top of mind for me during this election season. And then I think we can just discuss it. So I'll speak for a little bit and then we'll open it up for questions. I also want to say that part of the way that I speak is really through storytelling. So I just want to let you know that you can relax, take a break, turn your phones off, slow down, and just listen for a little while, and then we'll discuss. So just shy of 28, a moderately liked young man named Henry, confused about his future, grim about his prospects, decided to leave work at his family's pencil factory and try his hand at an old-fashioned pursuit called thinking. Our chap had a pal, a mentor really, by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, in addition to acquiring some literary fame, was cherished at that particular moment for his woodlot, a piece of land near a pond where Henry could begin his task. On July 4th, 1845, his country's Independence Day, Henry David Thoreau took up his abode and, in his immortalized words, lived alone in the woods a mile from any neighbor in a house I had built myself, on the shore of Walden Pond. An inappropriate amount of my fantasy life has been consumed with Henry David Thoreau. I don't particularly love his writing. I even take a kind of guilty pleasure reading all the articles that poke fun at his so-called independence at Walden Pond while receiving weekly meals from his mother. And yet, I am completely enamored with the boldness of his enterprise, the audacity to just kind of say, I'm out. I imagine I'm not alone. It has been a bruising few years that require new stores of resilience as we respond to this endless hailstorm of fears, of pings, of texts, of emails. I could go on. There isn't a public pundit in the land that isn't talking about the challenge of anxiety, attention collapse, and burnout. And now we are in an election season. And although thrilling for some, the grabby, tornado-esque news cycle can completely deplete what is left of our civic energies. Who wouldn't fantasize about a few weeks of gentle quiet and long books? Tonight, I want to begin by reveling in this impulse and making a case for how it can revitalize a certain form of civic commitment. Thoreau retreated into the woods to disarm, in his words, mindless busyness and engage in serious reading. He is not an aberration, but a part of an important American tradition, a tradition forged by pilgrims and Puritans, transcendentalists and pioneers, by essayists and preachers and poets who cared deeply about the freedom to think, the kind of freedom that allows individuals to pursue their most sacred values and form their own ideas that can add a new kind of air and sunlight to our collective civic life. But I don't only want to revisit the impulse to retreat, even for its highest purpose. The process that actually requires the most intellectual work, and I believe has the most to add to our civic disposition, especially now, is not about what happens when we leave, but what happens when we return, when we re-enter political and social life. So tonight, we will spend some time learning from Jewish sources, so rich in the rhythm of when we must withdraw and how we must return, as well as philosophical and literary sources with great expertise in how to come back, how to learn again about our country and its people. A few years ago, at construction sites all over the subway stations, there was a sign that drove me totally crazy. I imagine it drove you crazy too. Sometimes you have to go backwards to go forwards. I just want to go forwards. But now here I am, offering that same choreography for our civic life. Together this evening, we'll study the steps of the dance. We will move back and we will return. Thoreau retreated to the woods to learn to reawaken, in his words, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn. He went to the woods to step away from ingrained patterns of thought, to remain alert to all that is majestic in this world. He went to the woods for reasons that seemed personal, but he did so in a political moment vibrating with moral anxiety. Would slavery continue to expand across the American territories? Would the country soon be at war with itself? Would war be better or worse than the current immoral compromise? After 2 years and 2 months, he left Walden to be a sojourner in civilized life again. And then he appeared at the Concord Lyceum, in the same town as his family's pencil factory, and gave a lecture, The Rights and Duties of Individual in Relation to Government, where he described his own night in jail for refusing to pay taxes that would contribute to a war and the expansion of slavery. This speech would eventually be published under the title Civil Disobedience, and decades later make its way into the hands of a preacher from Atlanta by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., who had this to say about the text. I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Henry David Thoreau. The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Indeed, they are more alive than ever before. Thoreau's retreat into the woods gave him a kind of moral clarity and political insight. His time of focused reading and observation gave him a new way of considering a problem. When he returned to be a sojourner in civilized life, he offered a civic gift to America, which stretched beyond his generation to the one ready to receive it. For our people, the Jewish people, retreat can sometimes seem a little less optional than it was for Thoreau. At times, it might better be termed escape. So let's move backwards. From the woodlot of 19th century Massachusetts to 2nd century Israel under Roman control, to the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and a cave in the desert. And I know many of you are very familiar with this tale, but stay with me because we rarely focus on the ending. The story begins with Bar Yochai sitting with a group of rabbis, and one offers the following compliment. How pleasant are the actions of this nation, the Romans, as they established marketplaces, bridges, and bathhouses. One of the rabbis, Yossi, stays silent. Bar Yochai does not. Everything that they established for their own purposes. They established marketplaces to place prostitutes in them, bathhouses to pamper themselves, and bridges to collect taxes from all who pass over them. The content of his remarks spread until they were heard by the Romans, who promptly meted out the following punishment. For Yossi, who remained silent, exile. For Bar Yochai, death. Bar Yochai and his son go into hiding. They didn't have Walden Pond or Thoreau's mother's home-cooked meals, but they did have a cave, a very productive carob tree, and a spring of water. Every day they removed all their clothes, they only had one pair, sat in sand up to their necks, and studied Torah. When it was time to pray, they would dress themselves. After, undress, cover themselves in sand, and learn. On and on and on, year after year. On the 12th year, Elijah the prophet came, and they learned that the emperor had died, and the decree was repealed. But how do you leave the cave? For 12 years, they studied Torah without the interruption of fellow human beings, without the messiness of human experience. We have all done, minute versions of this, albeit with much less holy material. We have staged an argument in our head with a person we haven't seen for years. Their traits are frozen in time. Our argument is better than ever. But once we see that human being face to face, nothing we rehearsed makes any sense. We see solutions to problems at 4 a.m. while lying in bed, and then wake to face the actual world and realize how far from reality our minds have wandered. We simplify the world when we live at a distance from it. We want reality to fix our axioms, rather than allowing our axioms to be humbled by reality. This is not only a risk of retreat, but a risk of all forms of silos, of isolation, be they physical or intellectual. So it went for 12 years of miraculously sustained isolation, learning about God and existence solely through the study of Torah. Bar Yochai and his son emerge from the cave and see men and women, human beings at work, plowing and sowing. And this sight is repulsive to them. Bar Yochai says, "These people abandon eternal life of Torah study and engage in temporal life for their own sustenance." His critique of the world has remained relatively consistent. He berated the Romans for their overinvestment in the physical, and then he berates the Jews for a similar preoccupation, the demands of sustaining mortal life. The Gemara then explains that every place that Bar Yochai and his son direct their eyes immediately burns. They destroy the world they witness with judgment, with scorn, and with fire. And then they hear a divine voice. "Did you emerge from the cave in order to destroy my world? Return to your cave." So Bar Yochai and his son go back to the cave for 12 more months. When they come out, they are only partly restored. Everywhere that his son's glare would strike, Bar Yochai would heal. And then, just as the sun is setting on the eve of Shabbat, they see an older man holding 2 bundles of myrtle branches, and they ask, "Why do you have these?" The older man responds, "In honor of Shabbat." "But wouldn't one suffice?" they ask. The older man answers, "The 2 cave dwellers. One is from the verse, to remember the Shabbat day to keep it holy, and the other is from, observe the Shabbat day to keep it holy." Bar Yochai looks at his son and says, "See how beloved the mitzvahs are to Israel." Bar Yochai and his son reattach to the world. It begins with a question. Why do you have these? And with that opening, they learned something deeply worthy and beautiful. They learned that a man cared about the text, about the details of Torah, about honoring Shabbat. They learned that the values they so prized in isolation, Torah and prayer, had a place in this material existence, that a man honored those values and brought them into the flow of mortal life. They found something they could recognize, admire, and even love. And once they found that form of reattachment, they could again believe in the goodness of the world. Seeing this goodness permitted a different form of reentry, a reentry for the sake of commitment rather than destruction. Often when this story is retold, this is sort of where it stops. There was escape, Carib, Torah, reentry. But that's not quite all. Bar Yochai's son-in-law hears he is back and takes him to the bathhouse. Remember the bathhouse from his earlier insult about the Romans? And there he begins to tend to Bar Yochai's cracked skin and sore body. He soothes Bar Yochai with water with touch and with care. The bathhouse is now a place of healing and mortal physical recovery. After the bathhouse, Bar Yochai announces that to honor his miracle, he will go and repair something for the sake of others. To figure out what that should be, he quotes Bereshit. Vayavo Yaakov Shalem ir Shechem, and Yaakov came whole, Shalem, to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram and encamped before the city. Or as the Gemara actually translates that final phrase, and he performed gracious acts to benefit the city. But what does it mean to be whole? What gracious acts did Yaakov perform? A conversation ensues. Rav explains that Yaakov is whole because he's whole in his body, whole in his money, whole in his Torah. Rav continues, the gracious acts meant that Yaakov established a currency for them. Bar Yochai adds, he established marketplaces for them. And Rabbi Yochanan adds, he established bathhouses for them. Do you catch the parallel? At the end of these long 13 years, Bar Yochai finds that he values exactly what he criticized the Romans for building: marketplaces and bathhouses. The Romans, he once argued, established marketplaces for prostitutes and bathhouses only to pamper themselves. Bar Yochai's many years of isolation gave him a different perspective. He steeped himself in Torah. He brought to his reentry a particular pasuk that helped him understand both a human being's wholeness and the way that wholeness can give back to a city. His second reentry also gave him a different take on embodied life. Work and care for the body was not the abandonment of holiness, but part of a full and complete mortal life. Yaakov was whole in work, in body, and in Torah. Bar Yochai's renewed civic commitment was contingent on a certain form of isolation and reentry, an isolation of deep learning, and a reentry that offered a pathway to existence through the acknowledgement of goodness and beauty. We so desperately need this rhythm of a learned retreat and a sweet reentry in our civic lives. We need to be able to think straight. In fact, this insight actually created the vast college and university system right at the moment Thoreau was writing. But we also need to return to love the world we are blessed to live in. I have spent the last 20 years working with students on civic education. I have worked in public high schools, in private ones, in Catholic schools, in Jewish schools, in colleges, and in graduate schools. We do not know how to teach so that students can move from Bar Yochai's first exit to his second. What do I mean by this? We don't have a rigorous discipline for teaching admiration, attachment, love, and commitment in our civic life. And because of this absence, our students marinate in critique, in disgust, in anger, and in axioms. This is not to throw critique to the wind. I have great admiration for our critical faculties, but we must put them into proper balance. We cannot dismiss admiration as Pollyannish or silly. We must turn our attention to finding rigor in this positive emotion. And our own religious tradition is actually an impeccable place to start. Bar Yochai is but one example within Jewish sources, which offer a masterclass in the flow of intellectual, spiritual retreat and reentry. Whether it is for Shabbat, Chagim, or the rituals of mourning, our tradition is always asking us to move between withdrawal and reentry. For this reason, it serves as an inspiration and model for a renewed form of civic education and commitment. It's an unusual term, getting up from Shiva. I can't actually think of that many times we use such a phrase. 7 days after we bury a loved one, we conclude sitting and we are tasked with getting up. It sounds simple, but anyone who's experienced Shiva knows that it isn't. For some, you don't want the sitting to end. While you are in active mourning, your loved ones hover near, through stories, through company, through the intensity of togetherness. But even for those who want it to end, how to do so isn't simple. Here's a glimpse into the choreography of transition. The mourner rises early to start shacharit, beginning the day with a different form of urgency. The mourner is then comforted by visitors who leave and then return for the reproach. The mourner is told, demanded of, get up. Get up from mourning, and forced by loved ones, by those that prayed with them and comforted them to re-enter the world. In some Hasidic traditions, the mourners circle the house 7 times, reminiscent of a wedding. But for most, the mourner and comforters walk in the neighborhood. They are reintroduced to life together. The tradition understands that from Shiva, mourners will not easily return to the world, that it will feel different, strange, perhaps even harsh. And so returning is a demand. Get up, but you are not alone. You return with others. And then it is a slow, careful reintroduction, not through email or TV, not through the mind, but through the senses. You walk, you move, you see, you smell, and you hear. You are reintroduced to a newly empty and newly vibrant world. Havdalah is another brilliant guide to reentry. Every sense is reintroduced to the world, literally turned back on. At the end of Shabbat, that weekly treat, after nightfall, we fill our cups with wine until they are overflowing. We light multiple wicks that are weaved into one. We smell evocative spices. We chant prayers of confidence and trust in God and the possibility of joy in ourselves. We wake up our sense of sight, our sense of smell, our sense of hearing. We recite. For the Jews, there was light and joy, gladness and honor. So let it be with us. We have said these words at the conclusion of Shabbat under all conditions. It is a prerequisite to reentry. Jewish ritual offers many insights for reentry. It can be bettered by doing it with others. It can be eased by first alerting the senses, paying attention to our physical humanity. And it can be improved by focusing for a moment on the beauty and worthiness of the world and other human beings. There is an additional lesson from our Jewish sources about the relationship between retreat and reentry. Bar Yochai, Shiva, and Havdalah all find ways to honor the distilled values that were created during the time of withdrawal. Bar Yochai's reentry was sweet because it humanized the most precious ideals of his time in the cave: Torah and prayer. In Shiva, the mourner reflects on the life of their loved one, all that they cherished and will miss. They share those moments in the room and together, and when they get up, they bring the memory back into the world. And even in Havdalah, where the sensorial pleasure of the world is so emphasized, the echoes of Shabbat are present. In the candle, in the wine, in the next day's prayers counting the first day back to Shabbat. America does not easily provide for the rhythms of retreat and reentry. Finding space and time for significant thought and deep reading is a challenge. It is too easy to cede our minds to other people's quickly formed opinions, or to fill them with endless tasks and something we now call content. But even more worrisome is that we have few methods for reentry, which really means we have few methods, if any, to learn about the world in its positive light, to be introduced to America with a generosity of spirit that allows us to commit and re-engage with our country. This is a particular danger during election seasons, which inundate the country with a battle for a win that will always veer towards painting the other side in its worst and most reduced light. But in truth, it is a broader and more troublesome trend. The media has done a disservice by collapsing news with what humans do wrong. Article after article recalls failure, corruption, sin, what is despicable in us, rather than what might be worthy and even at times triumphant. But if we are 50% repulsive, we are also 50% beautiful. I see people nodding, maybe 30%, you can decide. Filled with noble attempts, good intentions, and hard work. It's not just the media. Academia has done a great disservice by conflating human intelligence with critique and criticism. We teach students that intelligence, that being smart, is when you can deconstruct, belittle, and dismantle. We live in a moment where it seems the only way we are able to learn about the world is by reading and listening to all that is wrong with it. If we continue this way, so out of balance, we will honestly forever educate ourselves and our children to try to destroy rather than attach and improve. I want to advocate that we take up the incredible wisdom of the Jewish tradition and build a civic discipline of retreat and reentry, a discipline of stepping back and stepping forward, one that pauses to ask how we might begin to learn anew about our country and its inhabitants, one that sweetens the reentry for the sake of commitment. We have a model for beginnings. We know that in the beginning, God created and God said, Ki Tov, that it was good. America needs such a method, a new way to learn about our country and one another. To arrive at this, we do not only need to call on religious traditions, although we should, but also on insights from philosophy, literature, and public service, which offer a concrete educational technique I call the sympathetic method. It is a method that, in partnership with many of the Jewish insights we have discussed, can help nourish a revitalized educational approach to learning, once again, about our country. And rather than a source of misery, it can actually be a source of great satisfaction. Let me explain. We can all recall a moment where we encountered someone different from ourselves, perhaps from another age group, denomination, country, or community. You might have met this person at work, on the subway, or even brought them into your home in the form of a book or a film. And at some moment, you began to feel for them. You could see that their deficiencies accrued honestly from the vagaries of life, that they were more complex, more flawed, and more beautiful than any quick judgment could ever surmise. You forgave their flaws and reveled in their moments of good fortune. This is the sympathetic method, and it is an invaluable tool for thinking about a way to return to America, and most importantly, Americans. Although I could call on many great thinkers to explain its methods and values, let me focus tonight on three. Adam Smith, philosopher-economist; George Eliot, philosopher-writer; Jane Addams, philosopher-public servant. Together, they offer an approach that, after a very important, brief, cleansing intellectual pause, can help us re-engage with our country. So 7 years before Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, that text of capitalism, he labored over the theory of moral sentiments. In fact, it was moral sentiments and not the wealth of nations that he returned to throughout his life, revisiting the text in 1767 and again in 1774. In this work, Smith is more concerned with a description and method of moral action than he is with the means and ends of self-love, or as economists may call it, self-interest. The book begins with the title of Sympathy and the following opening paragraph. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Smith believed that we can live together because we can feel for one another. This emotional potential is ignited not only through actual encounter. Pity, the universal emotion, Smith explains, can be cultivated through imagination. He writes, "It is by imagination that we can form any conception of another person's sensations. By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation, we conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. Storytelling can be an anchor in developing our human capacity to feel for one another." But pity, interestingly, is not the sole emotion of Smith's concern. Pity, he notes, is essentially hierarchical. One person feels sorrow for a situation or a set of conditions worse off than one's own. Pity offers a method towards social relationships, but it is one fixed in a system where distance can be secured. You pity at a distance that which you do not have to suffer. And so Smith offers a distinction between the experience of pity or compassion and the experience of sympathy, a quality of shared joy. Sympathy for Smith becomes the opportunity to experience another person's pleasure, the set of circumstances that stimulates happiness, worth, values. Smith's insight is that we can find fellowship with another human being through understanding what brings that person joy. Human beings have an ability to create momentary closeness by immersing themselves in the happiness of others. We can learn what brings someone joy and then, through the use of our imagination, begin to share and experience that joy ourselves. This, too, is a form of learning. Can anyone remember the last time they learned about someone from another part of this country, not through ideas and actions that we disapprove of, but through what those individuals cherish, what makes them happy, what they're proud of? In the 19th century, both pity and sympathy became the worthy subject of that new technology, the novel. The novel, with its added value of length to excavate the complexity of human character, offered a method to learn about others, to live with them as they move through the whimsy of youth and the moral risks of adulthood. If statistics is the form of knowledge that best describes humanity in its group form, narrative, particularly the novel, best describes human beings and their remarkable specificity, in their wholeness. It allows the critical functions to be put into balance with our emotive ones. It allows us to feel pity, but most importantly, shared joy. In her 1871 novel, Middlemarch, George Eliot takes Smith's ideas from the realm of philosophy into the emotive intimacy of the home. In the novel, Eliot illustrates the destructive costs of a life without sympathy and what a single human being with a sympathetic imagination can offer society. Dorothea, the protagonist, is a serious young woman searching out purpose in life through a potential spouse. She settles quite erroneously on the middle-aged Casaubon, a man his nephew describes as a dried-up pedant, an elaborator of small explanations about as important as the surplus stock of false antiquities kept in a vendor's back chamber. I really just included that so everyone will read Middlemarch, which you should. Dorothea and Casaubon remain alien to one another, as they are both caught up in their own myopic reality, their own silos. Dorothea through the excesses of youth, and Casaubon through the unbending habits of age. The confinement of their singular perspective, of their limited reference points, corrodes the possibility of marriage at its sweet beginning. Their honeymoon seems unconsummated, and the home they inhabit, while immersed in the verdant countryside, is cold, it's lifeless. They never learned to sympathize in the way Smith means with one another. They couldn't experience pleasure in another's pleasure, and the compassion they once had dissolved through the ongoing doubt and discomfort emotional distance created. Dorothea explains the marriage's collapse. And just as clearly in the miserable light, she saw her own and her husband's solitude, how they walked apart, so that she was obliged to survey him. If he had drawn her towards him, she never would have surveyed him, never would have said, "Is he worth living for?" but would have felt him simply a part of her own life. In this novel, Eliot shows the reader how a life without sympathy, a life of emotional distance, destroys the foundation of a marriage and a home and a society. But perhaps most importantly, Eliot shows us that human beings can cultivate, through education, life experience, and approach, a way of being in the world that opens the door to sympathy, to compassion, to shared joy. As Smith affirmed, we can cultivate a sympathetic imagination. We can be Bar Yochai and his son pausing to ask a man a question that helps us uncover the depth of his deed. In the novel, Dorothea is shown a life without sympathy for the sake of fully embracing a life invested in the wholeness of others. Eliot writes, "The presence of a noble nature, generous in its wishes, ardent in its charity, changes the light for us. We begin to see things again in their larger, quieter masses, and to believe that we too can be seen and judged in the wholeness of our character. That we too can be seen and judged in the wholeness of our character." And Yaakov came whole to the city of Shechem. We read literature because it's fun, because it offers us multiple perspectives. But Smith and Eliot understood that it also does something more. The narrative arts have the capacity to reach beyond our critical faculties and seize our emotional ones. We can learn to move beyond thinking about and into feeling for. As Eliot herself once wrote, "Love does not say I ought to love. It loves." Jane Addams, a great reader of Eliot, adopted her approach and strategically advanced it for the sake of democracy in America. In 1889, Addams moved into an immigrant neighborhood of Chicago and opened a settlement house. The house, which she named Hull House, would be a type of university that adapts and responds to the needs of community, helping with child care, education, and neighborhood issues like sanitation. But the most important work it would do was the work of what she called socializing democracy, ensuring that different groups could feel for one another. Addams understood that democracy would never socialize itself, and that all groups would self-isolate. At best, this self-isolation would lead to a failure of governance, where powerful groups only advocate for their own self-interest. At worst, it would lead to endless civil discord. And so Hull House became a place where different groups, be they economic class, nation of origin, faith, or even age, learned about one another, and they learned with one another. They did this in part through the simple acts of witnessing what others do well, what they are proud of. You will not be surprised to learn that upon opening Hull House, the first book the community read together was written by George Eliot. There are so many examples of Adams's genius for how to socialize democracy, but let me just share one example, an intergenerational one. She noticed that the younger generation, factory workers in their teens and 20s, had few ways to value the wisdom of their immigrant parents, and therefore came to dismiss them and even denigrate them. In response, she created the Hull House Labor Museum. In her words, "This was first suggested to my mind one early spring day when I saw an old Italian woman, her distaff against her homesick face, patiently spinning a thread by the simple stick spindle so reminiscent of all Southern Europe. It seemed to me that Hull House ought to be able to devise some educational enterprise which should build a bridge between European and American experiences in such ways as to give them both more meaning and a sense of relation. The occupation of the old woman gave me the clue that was needed. Could we not interest the young people working in the neighborhood factories in this older form of industry so that through their own parents and grandparents, they would find a dramatic representation of the inherited resources of their daily occupation?" After the museum was established, Adams recalled a certain Italian girl, Angelina, who came every Saturday evening to a cooking class in the same building in which her mother spun in the Labor Museum exhibit. In her words, "And yet, Angelina always left her mother at the front door, while she herself went around to a side door because she did not wish to be too closely identified in the eyes of the rest of the cooking class with an Italian woman who wore a kerchief over her head, uncouth boots, and short petticoats." One evening, however, Angelina saw her mother surrounded by a group of visitors from the School of Education who much admired the spinning, and she concluded from their conversation that her mother was the best stick spindle spinner in America. When she inquired from me as to the truth of this deduction, I took occasion to describe the Italian village in which her mother had lived, something of her free life, how hard it must be to exchange it all for a two-room tenement, and to give up a beautiful homespun kerchief for an ugly department store hat. It was easy to see that the thought of her mother with any other background than that of the tenement was new to Angelina, and at least two things resulted. She allowed her mother to pull out of the big box under the bed the beautiful homespun garments which had been previously hidden away as uncouth. And she openly came into the Labor Museum by the same door as did her mother, proud at least of the mastery of the craft which had become so much admired. In this story, Angelina could only see her mother through a distant gaze that ignited judgment, shame, maybe a little bit of fire. Adams created the conditions for sympathy, for admiration, for Angelina to grow close to her mother. She could find the openness to be curious. She could experience a form of understanding and even pride. Adams demonstrated again and again that learning about one another requires an approach. It requires an intellectual or perhaps better, a cultural discipline, a way of focusing the mind to find strategies that dignify and spotlight what another person can be most proud of, to ennoble rather than debase. She asked, how will we learn about each other? What will we see? How will we understand what others find worthy of love? The writer and scholar Marilynne Robinson reminds us that this was also one of the purposes of education, to let students know that the beautiful persists, and so do eloquence and depth of thought, and they belong to all of us because they are the most pregnant evidence we can have of what is possible in us. At its core, the sympathetic method is about developing the emotional and intellectual discipline to establish room for the beautiful, for the good, for the worthy, and to ensure that there are moments where we can all learn from them. This sounds simple, it sounds easy, but it really isn't. Somehow it has become bizarrely countercultural. As we all know, there are a million versions of Bar Yochai's cave, and we expect everyone to just emerge, to just come back, and somehow know how not to destroy the world. We can not only offer opportunities to see what others do wrong, we also need to curate opportunities to see what others do right. We need to create American forms of collective retreat for the sake of collective havdalahs, for the sake of moments where we wake up our senses and our emotions, and in the words of the bracha, present light and joy, gladness and honor to one another. Okay, so we've been on quite a tour. We've traveled to New England, to actual England, to the 2nd century, to the 19th, to rural ponds and desert caves. So let me tie all this together. Where have we been? We have looked at the intellectual value of retreat for the sake of for independent thought and value articulation. We have looked at the importance of reentry for the sake of reattachment. We have seen how dangerous returning to the normal world can actually be, how easy axiomatic, isolated thinking can lead to destruction. But we have also learned that there are methods, be they religious or secular, to make re-entry sweet for the sake of returning to a country we want to contribute to, be it by building bathhouses, marketplaces, or labor museums. So this election season, I offer permission to take a short break, a civic Shabbat, if you will, to give ourselves moments of retreat and total shutdown from the surround sound fire alarm that is basically every day, not for the sake of disappearance, but for the sake of entering a rhythm that provides for better thinking, for deep reading, and most importantly, for finding our way back to a country and to its people that so desperately needs to feel the awe and wonder of a new beginning. To close, let me take us back to where we began, to another writer from New England. 50 years after Thoreau moved to his woodlot, a young woman by the name of Catherine Lee Bates, a professor at Wellesley College a few miles from Walden, traveled west to teach a summer course on Chaucer in Colorado Springs. Bates and the other professors decided to ascend to the top of Pikes Peak. They began by prairie wagon and finished by foot. The child of a congregational minister, Bates penned a hymn, traditionally a religious song to praise God, but this time she chose to praise America. To praise without ignoring complexity, but to praise nonetheless. It's a hymn you might all recognize, America the Beautiful. And I give you 2 stanzas as a lasting reminder of the value of this too diminished art of saying, this is good. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Thank you. So we can discuss this, we can discuss other things. I don't know what's on everyone's mind, but I think we have mics and questions and, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. That was just really, really beautiful. It all sounds right and good, and yet we're in it, right? We're in the muck and the mire of the moment. And it's hard not to feel the disgust that you described us, you warned us against to some extent. And so my question is, what happens when the only thing you have is disgust?
From my rabbi. To be total, the reason I wrote this is because I feel like that's been my experience in classrooms. Like almost every classroom, and it's heartbreaking. Like students arrive and they feel like the country's not for them, or they feel like the country doesn't care about them or doesn't care about their family, or they feel like they should be somewhere else. And there's so many versions of disgust. The other thing that I would describe in addition to, sorry, just to add to your question, in addition to disgust, there's also a lot of like, I call it almost like a civic rupture, that even if you once had faith, that faith has been trampled on, and there's a sense of betrayal. So I think it's like a combo of disgust and betrayal that I see in my classroom all the time. And I think what I have tried to do is like, that's all real, but that's not a sufficient explanation for the world we live in. And it's not even a sufficient explanation of my students' lives. And so what I've done fun exercises like, okay, wake up this morning and try to write down every single thing that was provided for you. Pay close attention to what might be provided by the city. And then all of a sudden my students had this like incredible list, like they have water. Like they have, I mean, just when you really start, they have sidewalks, they have curbs, they have buses, their schools give them a Metro card. You know, like, but actually there's real beauty in that. It's not something, I think the thing that I've really learned is it is in no way automatic, and it absolutely is not happening without intention. And I feel, what I worry about, and I really tried to get across, is we've allowed so much rigor to inform how we critique. It is rigorous, but how we compliment is very flabby. It's like, it's not real yet. And so even that discipline of like waking up and seeing what does the city provide for me this day, that's like that could be a very rigorous pursuit. You'd have to think really deeply about it, and then who's providing it, and how is it provided, and what would happen if all of a sudden it wasn't sustained? You know, like, I just want to add more rigor to things that are actually working so that students can be put into a little bit more balance. I mean, I'm like a huge fan, by the way, in addition to water, sanitation is like my favorite thing to think about in a classroom. It's magnificent. Like, it's really magnificent. And if you think about it with students, also it's funny. So like, you know, it's a little funny, but it really can alert them to like how much good happens. And then if you are enamored with the sanitation department, that you might want to commit to serving the city. Like, you have to first become enamored with something we do well to want to commit. I don't know if that helps, Rabbi. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your speech. I really appreciated it. It's funny that you mentioned garbage disposal.
Yes.
You know, today I was watching the garbage men go down the street, and I had this moment where I remembered during COVID, we were all really thankful of the garbage collectors, and we thanked them. You know, and that was a moment in time where we were thanking a lot of people that we sort of since then have stopped thanking. And I just want to sort of throw that out there about continuing to live in gratitude, which is just like the briefest moment I had today when I saw the the sanitation workers and recalled what that was like not so long ago during COVID.
I also think, like, just your comment brings attention to me of, like, I'm really interested in teaching civics through infrastructure, not just through federal politics. Like, it's extraordinary to think. Actually, I don't know is Julie still here? I don't know, maybe she had to go, but she wrote an amazing article about pools and, like, lifeguards. Like, I just think the more sometimes we just need to shift focus. And it's actually a real crisis because we don't teach local politics anymore anywhere. We don't teach it in middle school, high school, or college. But that's actually the arena that I think has the best options of this form of attachment. Yeah, thanks.
I'll throw out one to start.
Yeah, sure.
Right. No, you can hear. I was struck before that you mentioned that Bar Yochai comes out and says, see how they care about the many mitzvot. And it made me think, as we're looking, especially at this election season and at our democracy, with our American Jewish lenses on, what are the corollaries? If Bar Yochai said, I'm interested in the mitzvot that they are doing, and I'm so happy to see that. What should we be looking at in wider society with our Jewish lenses on our eyes to be able to say, this is good?
That's such a beautiful question. I kind of want to throw it out to the audience. Do you have ones? I love that.
What I heard is gratitude.
Yeah.
For sure. And that is something that comes through in our text, absolutely.
I think that we have a gorgeous, beautiful literary tradition and music tradition and visual tradition. We have landscape. There's so much out there that I think that we could do that with. But I like the idea of Bar Yochai. I think it's a little individual. But I like that he goes into retreat and he's focused on Torah and prayer. And then that anchor is like he sees that reflected back in the world. I do think for America right now, like if I was like cultural czar, which is inappropriate for democracy, but if I were, I would be really interested in the artistic tradition that highlights a love of self-governance. Like small moments of self-governance. Like I keep thinking of like, if I were doing my murals, I think there's like this gorgeous thing we do in early childhood education that we totally let go of as students get older. But I don't know if anyone been to a preschool classroom recently? This would be like my Diego Rivera murals. But you know how every student has a job? Every single one. You turn the light on, you put the rug out, but they're like, we could really be enamored with American education that highlights and enhances self-governance. What does it look like to beautify that? What are all the different forms of it? To me, that would be like a really interesting, so since you asked, I would be really interested in that. And then I would hope that the artistic reflection of it will call attention to the fact that we've moved in our education system from opportunities of self-governance to a remarkable consumer model, where by middle school, it's very rare that you see students entering the classroom knowing like what is their job and why is it urgent that they've appeared. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much, Yashar Kochek. And I'm not sure I understood many parts, and so therefore had some difficulty synthesizing all the arenas you took us through. So I need to hear it again, and maybe with an outline. And my thought is, now I shouldn't speak for we. You know, I'm in a stage of life now where I'm not sure what to do. Like, what is my way to improve the world? I do what comes my way. If I get an opportunity, I give to it. But like with any other thing, like with learning music or with learning law, I have a curriculum, I have a direction. But here too, I think, B'kitzur, the essence is how we can make a better world by our conduct. And I have some difficulty in my life at this stage of life. It's a good stage, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I think a lot about it, and thank you for raising my awareness.
I think a lot. Thank you for your question. I think a lot about that exact question also. For myself, it's really, there is this like exhaustion that comes when you feel like there's so much to be done and you don't know which, how do you put one foot in front of the next? I don't have like an answer that is perfect for you, but I kind of want to offer one that might be imperfect. I think one of the reasons I wanted to bring in Jane Addams is I actually think one of the main issues we're facing is intergenerational conflict. I think we have really done a disservice by allowing every stage of education to be age bracketed. And so you get used to learning only with your own age cohort. And even with all this discussion of like diversity, I never hear anyone talk about age diversity in a classroom. But I think there is a deep, deep need for intergenerational moments of education. And I know it's not an easy thing to do, but it does two things at once. One, if you go into a classroom, you seem like you would be a gift to any classroom, or meeting with students or the public library. It's that dual encounter where you're now you're giving opportunities for intergenerational learning, especially if it's about America. But even more than that, then you get to be filled up with all the good energy of those young students. So, and it's a simple thing, but I really feel like I'm again and again feeling like a lot of our missed moments is intergenerational misunderstanding. Yeah.
We're going to take our final question.
Yeah.
I appreciate your observation about preschool and the learning of community. When my children, when we were living in Israel, I noticed something very different about grade school there. In Israel, when you graduate from second grade, say, to third grade, you stay with the same class. The teacher changes, but you stay with the same class. And this goes on all the way through grade school. And it creates a sense of community, which we lose here because, of course, our children change classes and teachers. But that aside, I was giving some thought to the difference between Jewish law and U.S. secular law while you were speaking. And it seems to me that a big difference is that in Jewish law, the idea is duty. Whereas in U.S. secular law, it's about rights. And during the last 70 years, we have built on individual rights, and of course, individual rights are a good thing. But without complementing individual rights with the concomitant duty, it becomes distorted. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, we have broken up into individuals and have lost our sense of belonging and our sense of community. And this has affected both the right and the left. We need to build community by teaching our children from the very youngest age that each relationship, each body that we are part of is a community that has value. And only by finding that community can we align to find common good. We begin to look for ways to further and advance these communities.
First I'll just say amen. I totally agree with you. And I also think it's the job of educators to actually think, there's a really interesting insight. Like, if your goal is to keep community, would you have the same kids in the same class for multiple years? What would their job, like some of the attributes that you want to see are honestly just not being taught at all because we haven't decided to teach them. And it's not, we really could. Like, I think we really could at younger ages. I think we really could in colleges. Like, there's been some excellent innovations in all of these, there's many, many different forms of national service now. And I think they are trying to figure out, how do you educate for obligation, and how do you educate for a sense of actual obligation to place. So it's not abstract, it's not obligation to everyone, but it's obligation to this actual place that you're working in. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Oh, Justice. Do you have one? Are we allowed one last question? Or no? No, maybe not. You can. I'll stay after. I'll stay after. Thank you.
All right, let me close us out and send us on our way. First of all, I hope you're stimulated and you're thinking differently. Tamara, thank you. Thank you for lifting up this sense that we have to balance critique with admiration and building up. Thank you for introducing the idea of a discipline of retreat and reentry. Thank you for giving us the imagination that the way that public discourse is working right now could actually be different, that we could have a more appreciative approach to looking at the world. And at a personal level, I'll just say, I think this is the first time at a Jewish event that my first degree in civil environmental engineering felt like it applied to whatever was going on, to think about water treatment and sanitation. That was a highlight for me. I want to mention, for those of you who are interested in this work, we have another partner at the Hartman Institute in doing our civics work. It's called A More Perfect Union. They are focused on bringing together the Jewish community into building up democracy. You may want to listen to the most recent, the most recent podcast released this week of the Hartman podcast Identity Crisis, that Yehuda Kurtzer talks with Aaron Dorfman, A More Perfect Union's founder, about some of these topics. And I hope we might see you at one of our next two programs, October 30th with Ilana Stein-Hain at Anshe Hesed, or November 19th after the election with Yehuda Kurtzer at Road of Shalom. So thank you to our hosts, the clergy and staff at B'nai Jeshurun, and of course the leadership and staff of Hartman who organized this event, and a special call out to Nina Kretzmer-Seed, who was behind the scenes making all of this work. We so appreciate everything you did. Have a great evening. You have a few more days to get ready for Rosh Hashanah. Good luck. Shana Tova.